There are periods in history when people do not live merely to survive but to dream. For Americans, the 1950s were one of those moments. World War II ended. The world breathed a sigh of relief. And America, the victor with its intact infrastructure and economy on the rise, rose like a waking giant. It was no longer the land of the Great Generation, burdened by bombs and bullets, but a place of young people, of dreams painted on black and white television and crazy rock and roll. The post-war economic growth in the United States was almost unimaginable. GDP increased from $200 billion in 1945 to more than $500 billion in 1960. A 2.5-fold increase in just 15 years. It was not just the numbers that gave wings to a huge middle class. Wages rose, prices were stable, and unemployment was low. What were once luxuries like cars, washing machines, refrigerators, even televisions, have become must-haves for every middle-class family. People no longer ask, "Can I have enough to eat?" but "Can I live better than my neighbors?" Interestingly, for many Americans, success is not about cash but about a front lawn, an armchair in the living room, and a cozy dinner with their spouse and children around a new TV. The 1950s saw the emergence and idealization of the nuclear family model consisting of a working father, a stay-at-home mother, and 2 or 3 pretty blonde children. This model was not only popular, it was worshipped and promoted in movies, books, and even policies. The man is the pillar. The woman is the keeper of the fire. But does that natural duty really bring happiness to all? Many women at that time, despite smiling in the kitchen with clean aprons, secretly felt confined and suffocated. They were taught that the meaning of life is to take care of their husbands and children. But their hearts yearned to be doctors, engineers, writers, things that society considered for men. The question, what is the role of women, quietly planted seeds in the heart of American society, becoming the premise for the feminist wave that exploded just a decade later. When looking back at the 1950s, people often remember the scene of the whole family gathered around the dinner table, talking about the workday, about school, about their favorite TV shows. It sounds simple, but it is a powerful symbol in an era of rapid development. The family is still an anchor. It is no coincidence that Dr. Benjamin Spock's parenting books became bestsellers at that time. He encouraged parents to trust their parenting instincts instead of following stereotypes and imposing. It is a revolution in the concept of parenting, respecting the child as an independent individual. In the collective memory of 20th century Americans, if we had to choose a symbol to represent the American dream, perhaps nothing could surpass the image of a small house with a sloping roof, a white picket fence, a green lawn, and a car parked right in front of the door. The 1950s was a period when this image was no longer just a dream but a reality for millions of Americans. After World War II, millions of Americans left crowded, noisy cities to find the suburbs, which were promoted as paradise for the modern family. This was not simply a movement, but a revolution in the way of life. In less than 2 decades, the proportion of Americans living in the suburbs skyrocketed. The agricultural and wild lands suddenly became the promised land for young families. Why did this trend occur? Because of the economy. With rising wages and government home loan support, especially the GI Bill for veterans, buying a house in the suburbs is much cheaper than renting in the city. Because of the belief, living in the suburbs means safety, a good environment for children, a healthy, clean community. Because of social pressure, newspapers, movies, and television constantly portray an ideal lifestyle. Everyone who is successful must own a house in the suburbs. William Levitt, often called the father of the modern suburb, was a pioneer in turning home building into an industrial process. He bought cheap land, divided it into lots, and then built thousands of identical houses on an assembly line. The result was Levittowns everywhere. Residential areas full of one-story houses. Uniform in design, built quickly and cheaply. Is that good or bad? Depends on where you look at it. If you were a recently discharged veteran with a wife and kids and a stable life, Levittown was heaven. But if you were African American, Latino, or any other minority, you would soon find that Levittown was closed to you. Racism was ingrained in the whites-only housing policy. Suburbs were beautiful, But not for everyone. Suburbs in the 1950s were synonymous with an uncanny uniformity. The houses were identical. The fences were identical. The trees were planted according to a pattern. Cars were parked in the right places. The post office, the school, the laundromat were all laid out in standard patterns. Designed life sounds ideal until you realize uniformity can easily lead to the trivialization of the individual. Those who were different, eccentric, creative, unconventional were easily seen as odd. Women stay at home all day, have little social interaction, and are prone to isolation and mild depression, but are not recognized because everything is fine. The pressure to be happy makes people hide marital problems, financial stress, and role crises. It is no coincidence that in this suburban cradle, many writers such as Sylvia Plath, Betty Friedan, etc. began to protest against the false aura of model family life. Friedan's book The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, called the state of many housewives the problem that has no name. A big plus of suburban life is the open living space. For the first time, middle-class families can organize barbecue parties in the backyard. Children can run around freely, and neighbors can invite each other over without prior appointment. Backyard culture has become a new symbol where adults drink beer, talk about sports, and children play hula hoops or kick soccer balls on the soft grass. But behind that fun, a closedness to the outside world is gradually forming. Suburbanites often live in a bubble, with little concern for the city situation, social issues, and sometimes have the mentality of just being safe is enough. If there was one device that could change family structure, consumer habits, and social beliefs, it was not a rocket or an airplane, but the black and white TV. In less than 10 years, television went from being a luxury item to a close friend and even a main storyteller in millions of American families. And so, a quiet revolution began. Imagine, in 1950, only about 9% of American households owned a TV. But by the end of the decade, that number had jumped to 90%, a growth rate unprecedented for any consumer device in history. The reason was not just because prices were getting cheaper, but because TV met the needs of the times. People who had just moved to the suburbs needed a means of entertainment at home. Young families wanted their children to have something safer and more controllable than going out. And above all, people want to update news, current events, comedy shows without leaving the sofa. The TV became the center of the house, where the whole family gathered every night. The living room gradually transformed into a TV room. Dinner became TV dinners, eating on an aluminum tray in front of the screen. Family culture revolved around the talking box. I Love Lucy. If only one typical program of the 50s was mentioned, it would be this famous sitcom. Lucy Ricardo, played by Lucille Ball, not only made the whole of America laugh out loud, but was also the first symbol of women on the small screen, innocent, lovably rebellious, but also very smart. After Lucy came a series of legendary shows. Leave It to Beaver is the ideal family standard with a gentle father, exemplary mother and 2 obedient sons. Father Knows Best reinforced the father as the pillar role in every situation. The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet was like a weekly family diary. These shows weren't just for entertainment. They established a definition of normal. Everyone should live in a certain family, behave in a certain way, dress in a certain way. The real world was much more complicated, but 1950s television chose to keep it neat, clean, and white. This is an interesting and controversial question that continues to this day. Early 1950s television barely reflected diversity of race, gender, or class. Blacks, Latinos, immigrants, there was little room for them on screen. If there were, they were often servants, sidekicks, or comic relief. It created an ideal but incomplete model of life. Clean, white, traditional family, no social problems. Many scholars believe that TV at that time did not reflect reality but created unrealistic expectations. Viewers were programmed to believe that all problems could be solved in 30 minutes. That women should smile gently while washing dishes. That children were always polite and easy to teach. But it cannot be denied, thanks to television, families had more glue to bond, shared a cultural language, The story of Lucy or Beaver became a topic of discussion at school. At work, at the dinner table. Television was not just a comedy. It was also a place where artists were born and raised. Programs such as The Ed Sullivan Show discovered legendary voices such as Elvis Presley, the Beatles, later, and many of the first black artists to be broadcast. The Lawrence Welk Show is a nostalgic musical style, suitable for older audiences. The Milton Berle Show, the Jack Benny program, shaped the style of American television comedy. TV gradually became a tool to standardize entertainment culture, helping a whole generation of young people share the same moment, whether they were in New York, Texas or Idaho. Not only adults, children also had their prime time. Who grew up in the 50s without sitting glued to Howdy Doody, puppet show combined with live actors. Captain Kangaroo, educational, gentle, and uplifting program. Mickey Mouse Club, where children dreamed of becoming superstars. TV is a storyteller, but also a babysitter. If television is a mirror of society, it is a mirror that has been polished to the point of illusion. TV families don't crack, kids don't rebel, couples don't argue, and that can make viewers feel lonely in their own real lives where things aren't as perfect as they appear on screen. But in all fairness, TV also laid the groundwork for later social conversations about gender roles, about race, about the definition of happiness. And that's something no other medium has done before. If television was the storyteller of the American family, then music, especially rock and roll, was the cry of liberation for post-war youth, in a society that was quietly lulling its children into a stable dream. A sound appeared like thunder from a clear sky, electric guitars vibrating, fiery vocals, and a pounding drum beat that woke every sleeping cell. Rock and roll was more than a genre. It was a generational manifesto. And it did what no music before it had dared to do: put teenagers at the center of popular culture. Before the 1950s, American popular music was still dominated by jazz, swing, country, and the gentle love songs of Frank Sinatra, Perry Como, and Nat King Cole. These were gentle melodies, suitable for adults. Teenagers at that time, basically, had no voice in music. They listened to the music their parents listened to. They dressed like their parents. They followed the mold of their parents. But then, a strange blend of black rhythm and blues, white country music, and a little post-war rebellion created what was called rock and roll. A completely new genre, completely unique. Elvis Presley, the white guy with the way he sang like a black man, the way he stood like a rebel, and the hip shaking that was considered too provocative, became the first and greatest icon of rock and roll. In 1956, the song Heartbreak Hotel took Elvis to the top of the charts, opening a series of 12 #1 songs in the decade. But more importantly, Elvis made teenagers crazy, and made parents mad. The sight of thousands of girls screaming and fainting when Elvis performed was no longer unusual. The media called him the king, but many newspapers condemned him as a moral threat to the youth. And it was that contradiction that was the strongest evidence that rock and roll had become a cultural phenomenon, not just a musical trend. Besides Elvis, a series of other artists emerged as pioneers in the music of youth movement. Chuck Berry with his unique guitar style and lyrics about cars, dating, and adolescence. Buddy Holly brought romance to rock music, laying the foundation for the later rock bands. Jerry Lee Lewis was crazy, bold, and uncontrollable on stage. Little Richard was free-spirited, colorful, and crossed all gender boundaries. What made rock and roll different was the content of the lyrics, no longer talking about vague romantic love, but about desire, anger, freedom, and resistance. Music became a safe place to rebel. And for the first time, young people felt there was someone who understood them, singing for them. In addition to the explosion of creativity, the success of rock and roll was also due to technological factors. The vinyl LP, long play, replaced the 78 revolutions per minute record, allowing more songs to be recorded, paving the way for the concept of the album. The compact, cheap transistor radio transmitter allowed teenagers to listen to music anywhere without their parents' permission. American Bandstand, a daily rock music television program, brought new songs straight to the living rooms of millions of families. So music was no longer in the hands of the big record labels or the older DJs, but in the hands of the young people themselves. For parents in the 1950s, rock and roll was a roar of chaos. They feared that this music would encourage early sex, rebellion, and moral degradation. They considered rock artists to be bad role models, anti-educational figures. They feared that this is black culture in a society still heavily racialized. But for teenagers, rock and roll was an escape from the constraints of the previous generation. They were tired of the immutable rules. They were tired of being a copy of their parents. They wanted their own voice, dance, style, and even life. Rock and roll, therefore, not only created new music but also created a completely new class of people. A young generation with independent identity. Something that had never existed in previous centuries. One thing that few people noticed was that the presence of rock and roll was also a victory for individual expression. It was the right to wear ripped jeans while the rest of the town wore suits. It was the right to have long hair, wear sunglasses and ride a bicycle around all day without any reason. It was the right to love music not because your parents liked it, but because your heart was moved. And it was this spirit, through music, that would profoundly influence the countercultural movements of the 1960s, hippies, anti-war, feminists, racial liberation. Rock and roll did not end with the dance. It began a cultural awakening that would last throughout the 20th century. The 1950s were not only a cultural and technological shift, but also a fundamental shift in the way Americans approached food. This was the decade in which fast food emerged not just as a form of eating, but as a way of life. A symbol of a new era, fast, convenient, mass, and commercialized. To understand the rise of fast food, we need to look at a few core elements of the 1950s. Americans migrated en masse to the suburbs, where traditional restaurants were few. Fast food became a fill-the-gap solution. The middle class exploded, and they were willing to spend money on conveniences that saved family time. The percentage of women who were housewives was very high, but they began to desire less labor-intensive cooking solutions. And fast food was the ideal choice. Cars became an inseparable part of the family, leading to the birth of drive-through service right in the car. All of this created an ideal environment for fast food chains to develop rapidly. And so a taste invasion began. If fast food is considered an empire, hamburgers are the flagship. Not as complicated as European dishes, not as time-consuming as Asian dishes. Hamburgers converge all the elements that Americans needed at that time. Cheap, fast, easy to eat, easy to carry. Some prominent fast food chains of this period. White Castle, established in 1921, but exploded in the 50s. Famous for its small square hamburgers. Super cheap at just a few cents. The store design is white like a castle, creating a clean, modern feeling, which is especially important at a time when people were still cautious about processed foods. Burger Chef, founded in 1954, invented the first combo meal. A burger with fries and a soda for just 45 cents. This combo model quickly became the industry standard. Pup and taco. The unusual combination of a hot dog and a taco exemplifies the American culinary fusion. Geno's Hamburgers and KFC collaborate. The origin of the familiar, one-stop shop model today. Lum's, famous for its beer-battered hot dogs. A very American creation. These brands have something in common: fast service, cheap prices, no long waits, and you can eat it right in your car. Eating is no longer a family ritual around the table, but a convenient behavior, like pumping gas or watching TV. The 1950s was a period when cars became a symbol of success. And fast food chains quickly seized the opportunity. If people were living in their cars, why not eating in their cars? Drive-thrus let you buy food without leaving the driver's seat. The waiter slid open the glass door, took your order, and a few minutes later you had a complete meal in a cardboard box. Children even started receiving their own meals, called kids' meals, with small toys included. The feeling of eating like adults and having toys made fast food an extremely attractive experience for children. More than just a way of eating, fast food became a symbol of maximized convenience, fast service, no fuss, no formality. The "I deserve to be served right away" mindset reflected the growth of consumer society. The extroverted, on-the-go, always-in-a-hurry lifestyle suited a rapidly developing America. However, behind that appeal are many problems. Fast food is often rich in fat, sugar, salt, leading to obesity, heart disease, diabetes, etc. Traditional meal culture is broken. Families no longer gather around the table like before. The fast food industry creates a model of cheap labor, shift work, no benefits that has a profound impact on the service industry later. However, it cannot be denied that for Americans at that time, fast food brought more than just delicious taste. It was the first dates at the drive-in with a cold glass of soda. It was eating ice cream with parents on Saturday afternoons after school. It was the first time being able to order your own food when going out with friends. Chains like McDonald's, although not yet booming in the 1950s, began to lay the foundation and would dominate the world just a decade later. But it was in the 1950s that fast food culture took root in the American psyche, becoming an integral part of modern life, in the context of a strong economic recovery and a society moving towards stability. Fashion in the 1950s was not only a story of aesthetics, but also a way for people to affirm their identity, maintain social order and express gender roles. This was a time when women were picturesque, with puffy skirts, white gloves, and bright red lips, while men were neat in suits, ties, and fedoras. But behind that elegant appearance were invisible pressures, prejudices, and the beginnings of quiet change. In 1947, French designer Christian Dior introduced a collection he called the New Look, with small waists, puffy skirts that fell below the knee, and hourglass figures. This design immediately became a phenomenon, not only in Europe but also spread to America like an unstoppable wave. Why did American women, who were living in the convenience and thrift of war, go crazy for clothes that cost up to 20 meters of fabric? Because after the war, women craved luxury again, because they wanted to feel feminine and pampered, something they had lost during the time they worked to replace men in the war. And importantly, because society was pushing them back into the role of full-time housewives. The image of elegance and softness was the new standard. Since then, puffy skirts, waist-cinching coats, and high heels became the indispensable trio in the wardrobe of any woman who wanted to be considered proper. The 50s was a period when standards of femininity were strongly imposed. An ideal wife was someone who always wore light makeup even at home. Women had to wear gloves and hats when going out, and could not be sloppy. Clothing must be discreet, elegant, pleasing to the husband's eyes, not attracting too much attention. That makes women's fashion very neat, orderly, but also restrictive and stressful. Beauty is no longer a personal choice but a social duty. But within that framework, the seeds of rebellion begin to sprout. Long pants, once considered only for men, begin to appear in women's wardrobes. Capri pants that hug the calf. Wide leg pants for a picnic. Shorts for a backyard picnic. These are convenient choices, but they are also a silent declaration. Women are not just flower vases. They have the need to move, exercise, work, and they want to be as comfortable as men. Although not strong enough to overthrow Dior's puffy skirt, those pants are the first step on the path to feminism, expressed through fashion. It is impossible to talk about 1950s fashion without classic accessories. Gloves, always white, always clean, and always worn when leaving the house, symbolizing elegance and restraint. Cat-eye glasses, both modern and charming. Women wearing glasses are no longer bookworms but stylish people. Small hats, decorated with chiffon or flowers, create a feeling of modesty, privacy but still extremely feminine. Jewelry, pearls are the queen. But besides that, colorful plastic beads also reign, expressing youthful personality. Each of these items not only beautify, but are a wordless language for women to position themselves in society. If adults are serious, teenagers are colorful. Bobby socks, white ankle-high socks, combined with loafers or sneakers are a symbol of dynamism. Poodle skirt. A flared skirt printed with a poodle is both cute and unconventional. A waist-tied shirt, pastel cardigan, and hair clip create an American dream girl style. Teen fashion reflects the birth of a new cultural class of young people with their own aesthetic taste. their own language, and their own market. Men's fashion in the 50s had two keywords: standard and serious. The three-piece suit was the unofficial uniform of every office gentleman. The fedora hat was an indispensable item. Not wearing one when going out was impolite. Main colors: black, gray, navy, sometimes with a bit of wine red or olive green. For men, dressing properly was a sign of success, prestige, and morality. But because of that, men's fashion during this period lacked innovation, lacked personality, and almost dressed to not stand out. Interestingly, while women began to experiment with trousers, men were increasingly constrained by rigid suits. An interesting paradox in a society that seemed to have very clear roles. It can be said that 50s fashion was a miniature map of post-war American society. It showed who had the power, who had to obey. It distinguished between men and women, young and old, rich and working class. It conveyed the message: who should you be? Who are you allowed to be? But also in that imposition, the first cracks appeared. Women began to wear pants. Teenagers wore colorful shirts. Young men chose leather jackets instead of suits. And so, the seemingly restrictive 50s were the foundation for the strong fashion breakthroughs of the 60s and 70s. There was no social media, no color television, no live streaming, but that didn't stop the passion for sports from burning fiercely in every corner of America. From big cities to small towns, from giant stadiums to empty lots behind schools, sports were the breath of the nation. This was an era when every hit, every pitch, every knockout punch could become a national symbol. Sports were not just entertainment, but a way for America to build pride, affirm its identity, and express its ideals of strength, discipline, and fighting spirit. If America had a sport that was synonymous with national identity, it was baseball. In the 1950s, baseball was not only popular, it was a secular religion for millions. Icons from the field, Mickey Mantle, New York Yankees, who had a powerful, thunderous hit, stood out for both his talent and his playboy style. He embodied the ideal man, who was strong, decisive, and charming. Willie Mays, San Francisco Giants, a black athlete who overcame racial barriers to become one of the most complete hitters in MLB history. Stan Musial, St. Louis Cardinals, a quiet, modest, but effective batsman who was a perfect model of sports ethics. The baseball stadium was not only a place to watch the game but also a place for first dates, where fathers taught their children how to cheer, where hot dogs, sodas, and cheers harmonized into the symphony of the American nation. While baseball was traditional, football represented modernity, strategy, and high intensity, true to the United States' rise as a superpower. The NFL, National Football League, gradually asserted its position, with dramatic matches broadcast on television. Legends such as Otto Graham, Cleveland Browns, Jim Brown, Black legend, Raymond Berry, Frank Gifford kept the audience glued to the screen. In particular, the college football tournament, college football, was also extremely popular. The University of Oklahoma, under the leadership of coach Bud Wilkinson, set a record of 47 consecutive wins, an unprecedented feat. Football became a sport associated with education, school honor and local pride, and at the same time produced heroes in armor, honored by the whole community. Nothing can describe the excitement of a boxing match in the 1950s. The lights dimmed. The bell rang. The two boxers stepped out and the fate of both was locked in each punch. This was the golden age of heavyweight boxing, with unforgettable names. Rocky Marciano, the undefeated champion, with a record of 49 wins, 43 of which were by knockout. He was a symbol of indomitable will and iron discipline. Sugar Ray Robinson, considered the greatest boxer of all time, with a style of movement as graceful as a ballet dancer. Jake LaMotta, the boxer known as the Bronx Bull, was the main character in the later film Raging Bull. Boxing was a place where poor, black, immigrant boys could rise to become heroes. But it was also a symbol of sacrifice, vulnerability and glory, blood and tears. The NBA, National Basketball Association, in the 1950s was not as popular as it is today. But there were names that laid the foundation for the era of superstars. George Mikan, who was called the father of modern basketball, with a large body and formidable defense. Bob Pettit, Dolph Schayes, Neil Johnston were the first players to turn basketball into a sport with tactics and systematic gameplay. Basketball began to attract young audiences. Students, especially in urban areas where every outdoor court could produce a star. In the 1950s, American sports were not only about achievements or titles, but also had many other layers of meaning. Affirming national identity during the Cold War period where each medal, each record implied, America is stronger. Shaping the ideal model, strong like Jim Brown, resilient like Rocky Marciano, elegant like Mickey Mantle. Create a space of unity where Americans of all walks of life can celebrate a goal. Sports, after all, is a social arena where human qualities are tested and celebrated. There is a paradoxical truth. The more we think back to the past, the more we realize that there are many things that should not be repeated. In the 1950s, a period considered stable, peaceful, and exemplary in America, there existed practices, concepts, and behaviors that today are considered wrong, dangerous, and even violations of human rights. So what was once normal, but now makes us shiver? Imagine you picked up a job posting in 1955. The first thing you would see is not engineer wanted, but help wanted men, engineers, supervisors, managers, technicians, help wanted women, secretaries, babysitters, sales, typists. It is perfectly legal and common to separate genders in job advertisements. The reason? Because society assumes that men lead, make decisions, women serve, support, care. If an ambitious young woman wanted to apply for an engineering job, she would be flatly rejected, simply because this is a man's job. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that discrimination in hiring based on sex was officially banned. It's hard to imagine, but littering was a daily occurrence in the 1950s. People would eat, throw the packaging right into the street, fill a cigarette butt into the gutter, going to the park, bring food and leave cardboard boxes and soda cans on the grass. Not because they were ignorant, but because they didn't have a clear idea of environment and pollution. The famous Keep America Beautiful campaign with the image of a tearful Native American, 1971, was a cultural turning point, but before that, littering was almost unpunished and unappreciated. Today, the idea of standing on the side of the road asking strangers for a ride makes many people shudder. But in the 1950s, it was a common practice among draftees returning home, a cheap way for students and workers to get around. It was seen as trustworthy and friendly, not dangerous. Society at the time believed in the kindness of strangers. Unfortunately, from the 1970s onwards, criminal cases involving hitchhiking increased, causing the practice to be banned in many states. And it almost disappeared completely. It may sound like a cruel joke, but cigarette ads in the 1950s often featured doctors to add credibility. More doctors smoked Camels than any other cigarette, recommended by physicians. In the days before health warnings, smoking was not considered dangerous but rather chic, fashionable, and good for the voice. It wasn't until the 1960s, when medical research began to show a link between smoking and lung cancer, that a ban on tobacco advertising on television was enacted. Swear jar? Not effective enough? Then put soap in your child's mouth. This was once a common punishment for children who cursed, lied, or told a lie. The goal was to wash away the dirty mouth. But today, this is considered child abuse. Causes damage to the lining of the mouth and stomach if swallowed. Causes psychological fear, loss of trust in adults. Today, this behavior can lead to criminal penalties or loss of custody in many states. If you've ever seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you'll know that lobotomy, the practice of inserting a needle into the brain through the eye socket to cut the emotional nerve, was once a legitimate treatment in psychiatry. In the 1950s, tens of thousands of people were subjected to lobotomy. From depressed people to quarrelsome wives, many were performed without the patient's consent. The result? Many became zombies, losing their emotions, communication skills, and memories. Today, lobotomy is condemned as inhumane, cruel, and anti-medical, a scary thing. With just a signature from a parent, husband, or guardian, you can be sent to a mental hospital, and there forever. The reason can be as simple as talking too much, not listening to your husband, seeing too sad after giving birth. In the 1950s, there was a lack of standards for mental illness, leading to abuse of family power and wrongful imprisonment. Many women, the elderly, and the disabled were locked up for the sake of convenience. It was not until the 1970s and 1980s that the rights of mentally ill patients were significantly improved. For a short time in the 1950s, radium and uranium were added to skin creams, powders, and even toothpastes with the advertising slogan, "Helps brighten skin, cure acne, prolong youth." Sounds scary? Yes. But at that time, people did not fully understand the harmful effects of long-term low-dose radiation. The result? Many people suffered from poisoning, tissue damage, and even cancer after a few years of use. Currently, the use of radioactive substances in cosmetics is completely banned worldwide. Some decades are remembered for war, some for depression, but America's 1950s are remembered for its enchanting calm, but also for the calm that obscured much. On the surface, it was a time of strong economic growth, traditional family values, social stability, and technological innovations that paved the way for modernity. But on the surface, it was also a time of constraints, inequality, invisible pressures, and suffocatingly imposed norms. The economy boomed like never before, the middle class grew, creating a social stability that many other countries could only dream of. The family was the center of society. Time together, shared dinners, family television all created a cohesive model of living that many people relish. Mass technology took off, TV, transistor radio, vinyl LPs spread popular culture to every corner. The explosion of teen culture, rock and roll, poodle skirts, drive-in movies, youth for the first time had a voice. The spread of Americanized lifestyles, from hamburgers to Cadillacs. The 1950s laid the foundation for the global influence of American culture later on. Gender roles were restrictive and unequal. Women were forced back into the ideal housewife role. The workspace was closed to them. Racism persisted. Suburbs were often white. Popular culture lacked minorities. Rigid moral standards. People who were different, especially LGBTQ+, had little place. Abuse of power in medicine and the family, lobotomy. Confinement in mental institutions, mental abuse of children, lack of environmental and health awareness, smoking was advertised. Cosmetics contained radiation, littering was common. The 1950s may not have been perfect, but it was a pivotal period, when the world was sitting up after the war, looking ahead and asking, how should we live? America at that time chose the path, stability, growth, uniformity, tradition. That choice brought prosperity, but at the same time buried the voices of the marginalized. The 1960s with its counterculture, feminism, civil rights, and alternative art were the young generation's response to the world their parents had built in the 1950s. And that is the eternal rule. Every golden age always sows the seeds for the next uprising. Be wary of too much stability. It is easy for society to fall asleep and ignore the weak voices of the minority. Normal is something that changes with the times. Today we laugh at lobotomy. Tomorrow we may regret how we manage personal data. AI, privacy. Pop culture is incredibly powerful. TV, pop music, fast food, sports. They not only entertain, but also shape the idea of beauty. What is right? What is worth living? There is no era that is purely good or purely bad. There is only an era that we need to deeply understand, so as not to repeat mistakes, and to appreciate achievements. 1950s America with black and white television, rebellious music, white picket fences, puffy skirts and burgers in paper bags may be in the past. But the questions that decade posed are still valid today. What are we chasing? Who are we sacrificing for our stability? What we consider right today, will it still be right tomorrow? History is not for nostalgia, but for illuminating the present and the future. And the 1950s, with all its charm, limitations, and lessons, is an indispensable chapter in that history book.